Everyone. Welcome to our cast-free webinar, UDL and the American Rescue Plan. I'm Allison Posey. I'm a senior content editor and producer here at CAST, which is just outside of Boston in Wakefield, and I'm honored to be your host today. This is a really exciting opportunity we're going to chat with you about today as our schools and communities transition from the COVID pandemic. The ARP, the American Rescue Plan, will provide funding to help states and districts to engage in opportunities that focus on learning and deepen the focus on equity. So in this webinar, I'm so excited to introduce the panelists we have. We'll discuss resources and opportunities that are available in the ARP and how funding can be used to support educators. And especially from our perspective, we see universal design for learning as a really important way that we can design instructional opportunities to reach every learner. So before I introduce our panelists, education policy expert Laura Calloy and CAST CEO Linda Gerstel and our implementation specialist Bill Wilmot, there are a couple logistics that I just want to let you know. First off, we want to hear from you. So please feel free to get started by introducing yourselves in the chat. You can go to the bottom of the screen, click participants. You can even click on your name and change it to make sure your name and job title are listed. You can click on the closed caption button. It's likely on the bottom of your screen and you can activate the closed captions. So Debbie, thank you for doing the closed captions for us today. We invite you all to contribute to the discussion as we go today. Please ask questions along the way, and we welcome your participation. For you all who are joining us live, welcome, it's great to have you, but we recognize there are going to be many folks watching our recording. So if you're watching the recording, welcome, we're thrilled to have you here as well. So at any time, please use that text chat box. Please click all panelists and attendees or just to all panelists if there's something that you don't want to go to everyone. You can also share through Twitter. So for those of you watching the recording, or if you prefer to contribute there, you can use our @cast_UDL and #CastPL at any time. So this is what's great about Twitter is we can extend this conversation beyond just this webinar. We hope that today will just spark the conversation to continue beyond this hour. We also have prepared a digital handout, and this digital handout will provide all of the links and resources and materials that we discuss in the webinar. So it's already set up with a lot of links, and should something come up and we think of an additional link to include in there, we'll make sure that you have access to anything that's mentioned or talked about today through that digital handout. So the bit.ly/cast-UDL-ARP-handout. So with those logistics taken care of, this is the exciting part. And so our panelists, I'm going to ask you to just say a quick hello, and then they'll each have opportunity to be able to share with you all some pretty exciting pieces today. So first, Laura Calloy, welcome. She's our CAST policy advisor. Hi, Laura.
Good afternoon. It's so great to be here today.
Also, I want to welcome CAST CEO Linda Gerstel. Linda, hello. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, everyone. Really thrilled to be here with you.
And our CAST UDL implementation specialist from the East Coast. Hi, Bill Wilmot. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Allison Posey. It's great to be here. One implementation specialist of many. Excited to talk about this.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our panelists, and Linda's going to set us up talking today a little bit about the challenge that we're all wrestling with.
So hello again, everyone. I'm so just delighted to be here with you in this very special moment we're all sharing. How many times this year have we all looked forward to a post-pandemic moment? And if that moment hasn't arrived for you, it's on its way. It's on its way. And I know that I speak for all of us, just the confluence of emotions around the anticipation of this time of joy, anxiety, wonder, what's going to happen? What is it going to be like when we all reconvene? This challenge here This quote really caught my eye. It's from the National Federation of Families. "I have no concerns with the school or its teachers. Everyone is trying their best in very uncertain times. But I feel that this year is going to be a wash for both my son and daughter. I dread next school year when everyone is going to be playing catch up." I know I speak for all of you, that is not the story you want to be able to tell at the end of this coming year. And these little data points of how caregivers, and caregivers is writ large, who was at home with our kids, what was the year like? Worse than expected, better than expected, as expected. And I know that moving forward at the end of the year, we're all going to want to claim that the better than expected is going to be the 75% or more, and not what the worse than expected and as expected is right now. So let's set the table for the next hour. We're posing Universal Design for Learning, AKA UDL, as your post-pandemic roadmap. An incredibly powerful framework, a set of principles, guidelines, tools, and strategies. This will help you pave the way for the coming year. I just want to say a few words about the power of UDL and how it can help you chart your course. The impulse in coming back to the impulse to only find the problems is going to be a strong one. And we'd like to pose that universal design, UDL, can really help you positively frame the challenges in front of you. It really can be your life partner in amplifying the opportunities as you address the challenges. UDL is an assets-based framework. It identifies learner strengths and removes the environmental barriers. It can help you reframe what the lingua franca is right now around lost learning time into lost instructional time, which is a very different perspective. There's lots of learning that has gone on. It's just not been traditional. How do we access that and honor it? How do we universally design for it? UDL will help you design for rigorous as opposed to remedial and substantive goals, and will help you to remove the barriers to achieving those goals. It's a good time to rethink some of the challenges that have always been with us and reorient ourselves into solution finders. The notion of finding solutions is very different than problem finding, and UDL is going to help you find your pathway towards that. UDL is a powerful strategy for advancing more equitable access and opportunities. I know we've all been concerned about the equity issues that have become center stage. They've always been there, but they've been highlighted in some very acute and in times overwhelming ways. We know that the experience of our learners, even during the pandemic, has not been equitable. Some have had more access than others. UDL is a way of creating more access to learning, first of all, ensuring access, and then access to good opportunities. Also, UDL is a way of making sense of data. Data is your friend, and UDL will surface multiple sources of data so that you can paint your picture of where the gaps are and where the challenges are and what the individual strengths that each of your students will bring. UDL can also be used as a management tool. And what we know is that the barriers to learning are not always in our classroom. They're sometimes systemic and outside of the classroom. How do we understand what those barriers are so that we can remove them? Barriers are ones that we most often create, and UDL is a powerful tool and strategy for busting them. UDL will help you design flexible options, will help you level the playing field. We know that the variability in learning, while we want to celebrate it and embrace it, it's a huge management challenge for each of us. We know that. UDL is a way of creating flexible means methods, and materials so that you can feel confident in really understanding the needs of your learners and being able to address them. UDL can help you rebuild a school community, an inclusive community, in what I believe is just the most authentic way. I believe we have a once in a lifetime opportunity here, in that the pandemic has been an experience we've all shared. While we've all shared this experience, I know that if I interviewed every single one of you, you'd have a different story to tell. How do we honor those stories when our kids come back to our classrooms? How do we honor their voices? Amplifying student voice is at the core of everything UDL stands for. Creating expert learners and empowering them around their truths is the uber outcome that we all want to realize. And I believe the pandemic has given us a very different kind of opportunity to write that narrative. Finally, honoring the new learning and experiences of our students, teachers, and families. How do we widen the circle of our stakeholders? How do we use the UDL management and tools to reach out with different communication strategies? How do we honor the pain points that we know that everyone has experienced and engage with each other in partnering around a more human-centered design that brings in our wider community, our community outside of our classroom? What we know to be true is that parents can be your biggest and most powerful allies. How do we engage them? They are our children's first teachers. And if any year had to remind us of that, this was the year. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues. Laura Kaloy is going to walk you through the many resources that you can access to engage with CAST around thinking about UDL, implementing UDL, how UDL can advance your goals and your learners. And my colleague, Bill Wilmot, is going to be doing what I know you've all come here for. He's going to drill down and he's going to really share with you how this can come alive in your classrooms, in your schools, in your districts, in your states. So I'll just end by thanking you for your time and with a little bit of a call for action. The problems that we're facing are familiar ones. They're not new ones, but we're arguing that the solutions can be new. And UDL is a way of helping you write that narrative that is not about playing catch up, but is really about a transformative vision of what a return to learning can look like. So thank you. And I'm going to look forward to hearing about all the wonderful things that each of you will be doing.
Thank you, Linda. And there was already a comment noting this interest in getting out in the community in order to, extend that branch of learning. So when we're thinking about learning, we're thinking beyond our classrooms, but within our systems as well. So thank you for kicking us off, Laura. We look forward to hearing from you about the opportunities in the ARP.
Good afternoon. Linda has really provided the frame for what UDL is and how it can help you step into the challenges ahead. And it's my role today to help outline the resources that are available to help you do that. By now, we're all aware that the Congress has provided our nation's schools with an unprecedented level of funding to address and mitigate the impact of the pandemic. And even just looking at this graph here, you can see that the funds are massive. When Congress started this conversation last March, a year ago, last March, they first decided to double what was the fiscal year appropriations for the Title I programs through the Elementary Secondary Education Act at about $13 billion. In December, the next investment was made at the level of $54 billion. And these are just the K-12 monies in this particular slide. So I'm trying to help you understand in the K-12 setting what kind of money we're talking about. So when you look at this all combined with the monies that were provided in December and then this recent investment of $122.8 billion through the American Rescue Plan, this is a massive investment when the Department of Education's total budget for the last fiscal year was $51 billion. So we're talking about, that's without Pell Grants, we're talking about $190 billion pointed toward K-12 education. And so these funds are, the 90% of these funds are earmarked and going to your school districts. And so we're going to talk today about the American Rescue Plan in particular, but I want you to keep in mind that these monies provided through the bill, the CRISA, or the Corona Reinvestment bill that was passed in December, most of the decisions haven't been made about that money as well. So there's a lot of money and a lot of planning going on around money that needs to be obligated and spent somewhere between September of 2023 and obligated by the end of 2024 by the time we're done with this full package of fundings. States and districts are required to target these funds to the impacts of COVID-19, including the learning loss of students. And in particular, Congress has made clear that these funds are meant to focus on the subgroups of students served under the ESEA: low-income children, children with disabilities, English learners, racial and ethnic minorities, students experiencing homelessness, and foster care youth. And so we're going to talk in a minute about how the funds are being allocated, but this is the focus that has been made clear through Congress. UDL really is a tool that can help you focus these dollars and address the barriers that these students and others may have their teachers and the school leaders in their buildings to address the impact of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So in thinking about this pot in the American Rescue Plan, I had seen a question had come in prior to the webinar around higher education. So you can see, I've included here just so that you can see in the American Rescue Plan that there was an additional nearly $40 billion given to higher education. And while we're not going to spend a lot of time on higher education today, if you do have some questions, feel free to put those forward. All of the money that is provided through the American Rescue Plan for education essentially goes to states as the grantees, and they each come through a different funding formula. We're going to target or focus on the monies that come through the K-12 program, and that comes through the Title I funding formula. States get that money and then they turn around and using the Title I formula provide the money to districts. And so your school districts are getting 90% of this $122.8 billion are coming to school districts through the Title I formula. I also wanted to just talk about that there is money for non-public schools, and I don't know if any of you are working in those settings, but every state is responsible to determine how to distribute those funds using a formula that takes into account students and children living in poverty served by those private schools. So we aren't going to spend time on that today, but again, I could answer questions if that's helpful. But the federal government is not dictating the use of those funds, except to say states must use a funding formula that focuses on students living in poverty. For this larger bucket, the $122.8 billion, they have received, states have received 2/3 of those funds have now been distributed to your state. And states were just put on notice last week that to receive the final 1/3 of funds, they need to develop a state plan that takes into account district planning for the use of these monies. There is a requirement that stakeholders are engaged in that planning process, both at the state and at the district level. Those plans must go out for public comment. And so if you have the capacity to work in a process to engage as a stakeholder, and the list is quite long in terms of the types of stakeholders that states and districts are encouraged to turn to for input, this is the time to be participating in that planning process because of that requirement to seek public comment and stakeholder input. IDEA funding money was provided for special education in the American Rescue Plan. So states have been given about a 20% bump to their IDEA allocation for this fiscal year. So at the state level, we thought it would be really important to talk about Congress made some very specific requirements in this American Rescue Plan that they did not make in the prior two education portfolios that were put forward. So there's some money on the table in terms of for planning and for implementation to address student learning loss, to address summer enrichment activities and after school programs that states are required to set aside out of their 10% of funds that they can hold back. They are required to target monies toward this. And I did a quick calculation just to give an idea here that, for example, in California, 10% of their ARP allocation is about $1.5 billion. And so you can do the math, you know, what 7% of that would roughly be, you know, around $1 billion would be going toward these three activities, addressing learning loss, summer enrichment, and after school. And then if you looked at a state, I just picked Georgia, for example, we're talking about $400 million. And all of these data are available in terms of the state allocations and what their required set-asides are, and what their district allocation, what the minimum district allocation is on the Department of Ed website. And then it's up to your state to notify and then make public what the districts will be receiving out of this pot of funding. At the district level, did we move on to that slide? Yeah, at the district level, there's also a new requirement in the American Rescue Plan that districts must target 20% of their American Rescue Act funds toward addressing learning loss of students. And I liked how Linda framed this, that we're really talking about addressing instructional challenges of students and thinking about what that looks like and how UDL can be part of the picture here. I just grabbed out of the statute some allowable uses of funds, but keep in mind, these funds are incredibly flexible except for this requirement of this targeting of 20%. Any allowable use of fund under any of the federal education laws would be an acceptable way to spend monies. Just to let you know, Universal Design for Learning is included in the Higher Education Act. It's included in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is, you know, the name for the our nation's Title I law. It's also in the Career Technical Education, the Perkins Act. And so if you're thinking about, as we hope you are, where UDL fits in, it is mention allowable use, in particular around how to train professionals, teachers, and school leaders in the use of UDL in these laws. And so I would argue it's a very acceptable way to use these funds. There is a focus on these funds, again, toward the instruction for low-income children, children with disabilities, English learners, and racial and ethnic minorities, understanding that many of these students live in Title I schools and their gaps have been increased and magnified by the pandemic. So just a finer point too on a couple of resources that we provided in the handbook, and then I'm going to turn the time over and Bill's going to tell you all about how UDL can absolutely be built into your planning and your work. But keep in mind that the resources that the Department of Ed is putting forward can be very helpful as well. There is something called Handbook 2, Volume 2, came out about 2 weeks ago, and it is full of examples, both practical as well as technical, and explaining to states and districts and to parents and other advocates how these American Rescue Plan funds can be used. And so I would just encourage you to take a look at that handbook. It's very user-friendly. It is quite long, but it's broken down into chapters, and it has some really nice resources in there in terms of if you were trying to have conversations in your planning, the Department of Ed has provided a nice framework for you to have that conversation, including how Universal Design for Learning fits into that. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be here today, and I'm available to answer any questions that you might have.
Fabulous, Laura. Thank you so much. And again, please continue to put your questions and comments in the chat box. And Bill, we want to turn it over to you to think about how UDL can support this work.
Yeah, so I've been working on this for a few weeks now, and just hearing Laura talk about the scale of this has my, my former administrator brain just churning about what are we going to do and how are we going to make a real difference with this opportunity. So we have these 4 questions that are tied back to the 4 ideas that Linda introduced in the beginning. And these questions grow right out of what Laura was just talking about. They grow out of the requirements of ARP, and they grow out of that US Department of Education COVID handbook, which is incredibly helpful. And however, it uses language that we might not typically use in the UDL world. So these questions are kind of an attempt to bridge between that language that you'll find in that COVID handbook around accelerating learning and lost instructional time to, so what do we do about that in a UDL frame? So how do we accelerate learning, address lost instructional time, and positively frame the challenge? How do we address the inequitable results of pandemic learning? How do we rebuild inclusive school communities and address social emotional learning needs? And how do we welcome everyone back to school by honoring the new learning and the new experiences of students, of families, and of teachers? As Linda said, we've been through this experience together. And everyone's experience, despite that, has been unique. So how do we understand that? How do we honor that and use that as the foundation for building forward? So we're going to go through those questions kind of one at a time to really dive into what does UDL look like in this new context.
And I do want to thank Susan for her comments in the chat, recognizing this is, make those bridges to post-secondary as well.
So before we dive into the question, I want to just, these 4 questions, I want to introduce 3 students so that we can really see this through a student's eye, through their experience, and through maybe the lens of that brings on this work. So I'll say these are not real students, but every detail about each of these students is a detail that I've heard directly from a teacher, from an administrator over the last year. So the students aren't real, but the details of their lives are. So this is Jose. He's a smiling young boy on the screen there. He's going into 2nd grade. He has struggled to learn to read, beginning in kindergarten when he was in person, in 1st grade when he was mostly remote, occasionally hybrid back to school for periods of time. His mom worked with him very deeply, working directly with the teacher to really work on building his fluency. The teacher had provided multiple ways to work on fluency, lots of reflection options to think about, well, which of these ways of tackling decoding is working better for me. The teacher was new to UDL, so she was trying things out. And Jose found incredible success using speech to text when he started doing writing assignments. This was new in their classroom, and he got really excited about it. So next I'll introduce Marie. She is waving to a computer screen and smiling on Zoom school and is going into 7th grade. She was going into this current year in 6th grade, very nervous about going into middle school. She actually enjoyed learning at home. She said there was less drama. There were fewer distractions. And over the span of the year, actually became very independent in her learning and was excited that there were new and flexible ways to engage with learning. She got to the point where She knew when she was stuck. She knew how to get unstuck. And if she couldn't figure it out, she knew how and when to email the teacher, what questions to ask to get herself back on track. So in a lot of ways, a very successful pandemic learning experience. And then our third student is Tariq, standing proud, young man smiling at the camera. He's going into 11th grade. He's had a 10th grade year of hybrid learning, largely 2 days on, 3 days off. When he did come to school, he was chronically late. When administrators followed up and tried to figure out why, it turned out that he was responsible for getting his siblings ready for school in the morning. And that responsibility made him late to school sometimes. When he had days off, he was at home, he was caring for his siblings. Halfway through the year, he got a job and had to take on that responsibility. He has been most successful this year when he's had the opportunity to listen to books and listen to recordings and take in information that way. Despite that, he has failed several required classes this year. The person who shared this story with me said that the failure rate in their school, in a high school, had gone from 10% to 50%. So he is going into 11th grade, but he is actually no longer on track to graduate. So those are just some of the experiences that we know are out there. So what does that mean for our planning for the coming year? So let's dive into that first question. How do we accelerate learning, address lost instructional time, and positively frame that challenge? Accelerating learning is a negative framing, right? It's an assumption, it's a deficit mindset, it's an assumption that students are behind. And as Linda said, students have learned things. They may not have learned what we typically would hope that they would learn in school. But beginning from that place of deficit is not the place to begin for positive learning going forward. So what can UDL offer us as we're thinking about how to positively frame this challenge? The UDL principle of multiple means of engagement has come up more times in my conversations with teachers this year than anything else. So going there first in the guidelines. How do we make content flexible so that learners can engage through something that matters to them? Identifying barriers that may be embedded in the curriculum. How do we use flexible formative assessment strategies? We know that money that's going to come into schools is going to have to be targeted to people who've been most severely impacted by the pandemic. And our typical assessment strategies would be to offer a standardized assessment, identify those students who are most behind, and target the money that way in ways that tend to be rather inflexible. How do we instead think about flexible, formative, ongoing assessment strategies so that we can really be adaptive in how we meet the needs of learners? And finally, how do we just share clear goals with learners, right? So that the intervention is not happening to them, it's happening with them. So that maybe they are behind an age grade norm in learning to decode. How do we bring them into that process of pursuing that goal of learning to decode? How do we offer them formative feedback along the way? So we know that their money is going to be spent on providing additional instructional time, whether that's through summer programs, after school programs, tutoring programs. Imagine if we took that kind of typical tutoring program that we imagine, standardized assessment identifies the students who are most behind, and tutors are, and they get one-on-one tutoring. Imagine that instead, we change that tutor into an expert learning coach, where that's embedded in the classroom. So rather than offering, say, Jose, just one way to approach writing, our expert learning coach offers him multiple ways to get out his ideas, to get started, and in that process discovers that Jose loves the speech to text, that he was immensely proud that he was able to write so much using speech to text. An important part of this, of preparing for this and of sustaining this positive framing over time, is to gather feedback from stakeholders. And that is at every level. So surveying parents, asking students about their experiences of the pandemic, asking them about their experiences at the end of a lesson, so that we can be incorporating that kind of feedback into our thinking all of the time. So how do we address the inequitable results of pandemic learning?
And Bill, before you jump into that, I just want to note, I can envision this in any learning experience from the beginning. So there's that proactive approach that UDL can really allow us to design for before we even meet Jose or any of our other students.
That's right. So how do we address the inequitable results that we know exist, that Laura pointed to, that the ARP funding and ACT points to itself? So let's start again with the guidelines, right? Let's focus on that top row of the guidelines to ensure that everyone has access to learning. How do we start by recruiting interest? How do we design for that? How do we design so that there are multiple means of perceiving content? And how do we design so that students have options in the ways that they physically act and manipulate the environment? Next, an important piece of this is coordinating our UDL work, our UDL implementation with culturally responsive teaching and other equity frameworks that may already exist or that in your school, or that you may need to bring into your school or district. We know that this is essential to engaging all learners. So another story that I heard from teachers in California during the pandemic, a single parent household, single mom with 7 kids managing remote learning, and she was working outside the home during the pandemic. So you can imagine the inequities that are going to result from those kinds of situations. And we know that statistically, people of color are more likely to be working outside the home during the pandemic. And studies are already showing a widening achievement gap. And the barriers, so many of those barriers are the reason for those inequitable results. Now, some barriers are in our control and some are not. And this pandemic has really kind of highlighted those barriers in a new way, and highlighted barriers that are unique to the pandemic, but highlighted barriers that have been there all along. So an important part of addressing inequitable results is identifying the barriers. And those are certainly barriers that are embedded in the learning environment. But Linda was pointing to, there are systemic barriers embedded in the way that we've designed schools and the way that we've designed the systems and structures of schools that also need to be addressed. And we can also use UDL to think about how we address those barriers. So in addition to that widening of gaps and kind of the magnifying effect, there have been unexpected results from the pandemic, right? Students who were successful in ways that surprised us, and students who didn't thrive in ways that we might have expected when we might have expected that they would. So maybe Marie is an example of this, a student who thrived in a way that maybe people didn't expect that she might. So in addition to the barriers that contribute to that widening gap, we need to investigate barriers and opportunities that may have taken place during pandemic learning that just kind of, I think of it as the funhouse mirror effect that had unexpected results that we really need to understand. And the part of understanding that, we have in the last year been incredibly flexible and incredibly creative to find ways to minimize the barriers that have been that are embedded in pandemic learning. Well, some of those same barriers will persist. So how do we capture, how do we document what we've done What have been the most effective practices over the last year and a half? And how do we carry those forward? To me, that's an essential part of kind of putting teachers at the center of this and putting teachers at the center of trying to identify what has really worked during the pandemic and how they can carry that forward.
Thank you. And Bill, before we go to the next slide, one of my favorite things about UDL is that those barriers are identified in the environment. I know that's been said, but I think it's worth emphasizing again that we're not looking at barriers in the individual, but we're reframing those barriers in the environment.
And what I love about that framing, Allison, is that it's incredibly empowering for educators, because now I've identified a barrier and now I have a framework to understand that barrier and do something about it. And
the student doesn't think there's something wrong with me. There's a barrier in the environment, and that's empowering. Bill and I could go on like this for a while. So here's our next question.
So how do we rebuild inclusive school communities and address social emotional learning needs? So providing options, I'll always go, you'll see my first bullets always go straight to the guidelines. Provide options for self-regulation and executive function. So think about how I could design that into the learning environment, so that social emotional learning needs aren't just about getting those addressed over here and then coming to the class ready. It's built into the pedagogy, built into the learning environment. And then just put social emotional learning goals on the table and let's pursue those and find new ways to pursue those social emotional learning goals. Certainly with people who are specifically focused on that, but thinking about how do we integrate that into math class. I think one of the practices that became a widespread during pandemic learning that I don't want to go away ever is I took 3 minutes at the beginning of class to check in with my students to just see how they were doing. That's the kind of thing that we want to carry forward. And then a big part of this is that we know that some students and families have had difficult and traumatic pandemic learning experiences. And we need to address that reality. One principal shared with me, they were transitioning from having half-size cohorts in a hybrid model, and they were transitioning to going back with everybody in the classroom. So each teacher had an A cohort and a B cohort, and they had never met each other, but they were a part of one class. When they came back together, there was a sudden spike in bullying incidents. And I asked her, so why do you think that is? What do you attribute that? And she said that she thought there was underlying anxiety, that there was underlying fear, and that students were just less practiced at being with each other, at understanding each other, at resolving conflict. So that's a very core need. And also, the flip side of the negative experiences are that there were positive experiences, and it's likely that every family and every student had both. So stepping back to think about Tariq as he's entering back into the classroom, he spent a year caring for his siblings, and I'm sure he learned a tremendous amount doing that. So how might he be set up to thrive in English class if he's given the option to write about something that really matters to him, something that where he really learned something new and is bringing something new in his learning environment. So this last question, I think, is incredibly important. How do we welcome back everyone back to school by honoring the new learning and experiences of students, families, and teachers? So that first one is engage all stakeholders in a human-centered design process. Put the people at the center of your planning. So a new report that just came out from National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers encourage everyone to find creative tools to engage stakeholders early, and they specifically pointed to co-design. So on the last several slides, I've pointed to barriers. The purpose of a human-centered design process is twofold. One, to identify barriers and opportunities. So both instructional and systemic barriers. By talking with parents, by talking with students, by talking with teachers, to identify what did not work, and what has actually not worked at all to date, and what worked incredibly well, and how do we seize that? What are the opportunities there? And then the second purpose of that kind of process is to connect with students, teachers, and families, to understand their experience over the last year, and to understand what they learned. To me, that part of connecting is going to be so important for building back the communities that we have always wanted to strive toward in our schools. We have to embrace the variability. We have to gather feedback along the way, and we have to use UDL to design for everyone. Of course, we have the UDL guidelines. That's one of our first go-to places. Coming soon in June, we are going to release the UDL school-wide implementation and certification criteria, which is a roadmap for thinking about implementation, not just in the classroom, but across the entire school. So it's a resource for kind of understanding and navigating the opportunities and barriers that might be embedded in the systems of school. So thinking beyond just teaching and learning to the environment and culture of school, to leadership and management, and to professional learning. So that new tool is coming soon.
That's only a month away, Bill.
It's
coming
only
really
a month
soon.
away. I'm so excited.
You all won't have to wait long. Don't worry.
As you know, Allison. So how do we build that welcoming school culture that we're always looking for? But also, how do we build a welcoming pedagogy? How do we embrace that variability and invite learners into their learning? How do we create an environment where everyone can say, I belong here? I think that's what UDL can do for us. And I think that that's the unique opportunity of this particular moment, and using UDL to think about this particular moment.
I just want to hang there on that phrase a little bit. I really appreciate that. I belong here. And that's for the educators, for the students, for the parents, just for the whole community. Thank you for that, Bill.
So just a few ideas on what professional learning might look like if we're trying to pursue this. So if we're hiring those tutors to mitigate learning loss, why not make those expert learning coaches, right? Why not introduce them to UDL so that they really understand that process of helping a student become an expert learner, not just learn specific content. If we have teachers who already have a background in UDL, how do we build on that? How do we focus that specifically on this moment? Maybe focusing in on engagement. Instructional rounds is a process to really study instruction with a UDL lens. How do we use that to think about what's worked in this past year, and how do we build forward from there? And finally, these lesson design studios, which I've done now several of remotely, are an opportunity for teachers to collaborate, to share practices. This is another opportunity to reflect on what are we taking away from this past year? How do we share that with each other and build on that as a foundation for future? So how do we use essentially UDL to build on the foundation of our experiences of the past year? By supporting each other through the challenges that we know are there, while also using what we've learned to build toward a more equitable future.
And if you're wanting to take next steps now, we have some ideas for you. We have the digital handout, as we mentioned, and in that there are professional learning opportunities, there are resources, all of the documents that were referenced in this webinar are available in that digital handout. So please know that that's there and use it. And if you have questions that are beyond, again, just a quick Q&A here at the end, please contact arp@cast.org to ask us questions about policy, to learn more about our CAST professional learning opportunities. We really would love to roll up our sleeves and dig in a little bit. And to that end, actually, a question came in, Bill, wondering about UDL aligning with trauma-informed practices. Now, I do know that's a big topic, but I didn't know if you had just a couple words that you might want to share about how UDL can align with trauma-informed practices.
So my colleague Melissa is the expert on this. So I'll do my best at kind of channeling Melissa.
And
So
she, I think, may be in the chat. So yep, there she
and
is.
Melissa can answer in the
Thank you,
chat
Melissa.
whatever I miss. Two things that I know, clarity around goals and expectations is central with both lenses. And what comes along with that is flexibility in how we get there. So some measure of predictability and some measure of flexibility. So I think is common to both frameworks.
Excellent. Thank you
And
very
Melissa
much.
will add in the chat.
Fabulous. Thank you. And I do want to give a pause for a moment to see if there are any other pressing questions that you all may have for any of our panelists now that we've explored a little of the why this matters, what the policy is, and then some real ways to roll up your sleeves and think about those 4 questions. We look forward to hearing any questions you may have. Oh, thank you. Melissa just shared a talk from a Santa Clara Inclusive Conference that she gave, so that can dive a little bit deeper. Thank you, Melissa. We appreciate that.
So I want to remind us of that quote that Linda shared at the beginning. I have no concerns, this is from a parent, I have no concerns with the school or his teachers. Everyone is trying their best in very uncertain times. But I feel that this year is going to be a wash for both my son and my daughter. I dread next school year when everyone is going to be playing catch up. So how do we transform that? How do we think about using UDL to transform that quote so that what we're hearing at the end of next year is that teachers have worked so hard to listen and to learn about my child and me, really. It's like they were using these conversations as a foundation for rethinking how we open school.
And I am pausing there just to really let that sink in a little bit. And I hope you're able to take some time before the start of the year next year to think about how you can reframe and rethink that reopening and the conversations you're going to have. I recognize there is a hand up and I'm not able to get your name. So if you have a hand up, if you could please put your question in the chat box, that would be fabulous. That will help us to access your question. Laura, we wanted to invite you to have a final reflection on UDL and what we're sharing, the opportunities in the ARP.
Thanks. We thought it would be really helpful to just continue to frame the focus that not only Congress, but the administration is really using to emphasize how these funds can be most impactful. And so I thought this quote from Secretary Cardona, who just a few weeks into his, after being confirmed, wrote a letter to the state commissioners where he said that it is particularly important that ARP and the ESSER is the elementary and secondary funding will enable states and school districts, as well as schools, to support students who have been most severely impacted by the pandemic and are likely to have suffered the most because of the long-standing inequities in our communities and schools. And just looking at the range of you that have signed on and said hi in the chat, I know in many of I don't live where you live, but I'm familiar with the data in some of the places where you live, that these are longstanding inequities for many of our children in the communities in which you live and teach and work. And so just knowing that you've got the opportunity to bring UDL to the fore in addressing and thinking about the systemic problems and thinking systemically about how to address those problems is just something that I wanted to say before we said goodbye today. So thank you. And if there's more we can provide that you can't find through the Department of Education website, just let me know. I'm happy to help you in any way.
Fabulous, Laura. Thank you. And in that, encouraging you to think about your own context, there was a question as well about applying UDL into building effective online programs and higher education. So yes, we would say the same UDL process that, and I'm just going to pull some of the words that Linda, Laura, and Bill shared during this conversation today, honoring variability, using UDL to help rewrite the narrative, anticipating, amplifying learner voice, thinking about those opportunities for formative feedback. I appreciate how Bill said the first thing I put on every bullet is something in the UDL guidelines. So really, when I get lost, those really help ground me. And where are the barriers? And you can look at those different guidelines to frame the barriers in the environment. So we look forward to connecting more about thinking about all sorts of learning contexts, including the online programs in higher education. And thank you, Mindy, for being with us in the chat. And there's a link to those UDL guidelines. So we do hope that you keep in touch with us. We have a CAST newsletter that really shares a lot of the exciting opportunities that come up and ways to reach out to us. Here's a great opportunity. The Anti-Racism book by Andrea Tisha Fitzgerald is one of our titles that you can save 25% on CAST publishing titles. You can just use the code ARP 2021. Some other ones that we think might connect to the reopening and let's go back to school next fall. Take a look at Unlearning, Supercharge Your Professional Learning. And here's one on online learning, UDL in the cloud. So there are several different titles for you to get a discount code on through May 31st. So get a reading group, and always appreciate hearing from you. This webinar was one that we hope we get some feedback on. And if you have ideas for other webinars that you would like for CAST to host, then we invite you to take our survey to let us know how we can meet your needs that way. So go after those rigorous, substantial goals, honor the variability in your community, take care of yourselves. And we really look forward to hearing from you and to keeping in the conversation going with you. We hope this sparked a conversation today that will continue on how we can design equitable learning opportunities for every individual in our community. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Debbie, to our captioner. And thank you to Laura Kaloy, Linda Gerstel, and Bill Wilmot for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.